Hello, my name is Dennis Cerrotti, and this is the Mazzini Society Report. We're going to be continuing the conversation on Thomas Morton today. If you've already tuned in, you've heard the first two parts of the series. You know what a wonderful teacher Dr. Dempsey has been, providing us a real masterclass on this incredible figure in American history. So without any further comments, we're going to jump right into the conversation today. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your support. Welcome again. It's great to see you all back. We're going to begin the third session on Thomas Morton today. And I wanted to start with a little insight that I had, so I've been considering some of the discussions we've had. I also went back and I reviewed a little bit of Morton's book, New England's Canaan, which you published, Jack, and it's just such a wonderful book. I wish I had time to go through the whole thing. But one of the insights that I had with the book is how visionary Thomas Morton must have been to put this book together into three sections that are absolutely relevant to all of us today. He begins with the section on the environment, what he experienced, and not just his love of the place, but also he did a pretty good evaluation of how this place could support human life and how it needed to be maintained. And then, the environment, the first of one of the great environment existentialist threats that we're facing today. If we could go back and read his stuff again and understand, what he was trying to say to us back then, 4 centuries ago, it's amazing. So then the other thing is racism. The second section on Native Americans and the wonderful experience that he had meeting these people and understanding how well they were able to live within the environment. And he wanted to see the English appreciate that. And he brought this not just a concern, but really it was a celebration of how well they did. And, he made a lot of comparisons between the English way and the Native American way, of course, showing the Native American way to be far superior in many things, except they didn't have salt. That was one of the things, one of the few criticism. He said if they had salt, they wouldn't have to be hungry back in the spring. So that was cool. But then the other one is extremism, religious extremism, and autocracy, and all the things he experienced in the people of Plymouth. And of course, we don't have to really go too far to understand that this problem's been with us since Thomas Morton, and it's really at the top of our list of existentialist threats today. So 1, 2, 3. He hit the three existentialist threats that we're facing in the world today, in our country, and I think this is really universal. It exists in many different places in many different forms. So, at any rate. Just wanted to mention that as kind of a kickoff as we get going. And at this point, we'll turn it over to Jack. And there we go.
Thank you very much, Dennis. If my memory at this age is still working, I want to mention that I think multiple people have thought Morton had a visionary aspect to him, but it was always visionary and practical. And I think the way those two go together is that he was willing to use methods that allowed people to go with their natural inclinations. I think people are good most of the time, unless they get too much power. And I think Morton understood that if you offered people a framework within which to apply their instincts to treat each other right, because it's in your own interest, then you can build something very interesting. And as for touches, many people have said, well, Morton was a big part of the colonial project too. There's no denying that. His book 2 commodities list is in part an attention to England, to ask them to say, look at how wealthy you can get with all the resources over here. But his watchword was respect. And in an early chapter on Native Americans, he mentions in vivid detail the plague and the results of it. And he says, and this by the glory of God has swept away most of the native people to the benefit of England. But in echoing that note from so many other writers who meant it literally, Morton puts a little gloss on the side of the page and it says, let's say, 2 Corinthians 9. You go and look up that Bible reference and you know what it says? It's when King David is talking to God, why have you afflicted my people with a plague? And he says, they haven't done anything to deserve this. They haven't done anything to deserve this. So he's qualifying immensely that note, you know, and racism was not, well, could not be in Morton's vision an integral part of a future of respect and cooperation. It just had no place. He wasn't bothered by people's differences. And we talked earlier in the program about his boyhood and cultural influences that created a lot of tolerance, practicality, and visionary aspects to his work. And finally, I will mention it here rather than go into it as I lay out the last part of Morton's life, just in the basic biographical facts. When he first returned from his first exile, that'd be 1629, he went to a meeting up in Salem that had been called for all the planters and old comers by the Puritans, led by Captain Littleworth, as he dubbed John Endicott. And they presented a scheme where all you traders are going to sign up with us. You're going to trade under our supervision, and we'll protect you, the old scam, and you'll give us payment from whatever it is you make. And Morton says, well, the lawyer talking here from one of the benches, he says, well, would you be willing to put into this agreement the phrase, so long as nothing be done contrary or repugnant to the laws of England? And they refused. So Morton refused. So he, to anticipate Roger Williams a few years later, is out loud just saying, no, I'm not going to just agree that you're the ones who are going to construe the meaning of the word according to each person's situation, and it will be up to your judgment to decide their fate. What are you, crazy? We need laws. So this guy who's been praised, well, cursed really, as a libertine and an outrider and a traitor to this race and all that, he was the voice of law and order. Everything about him is inverted, you know? So I really appreciate your close readings of those aspects of Morton. And I'd like to see what Nina and Yonca think about those points too, if they'd like to.
Well, I have one thing that I reread parts of the book this morning just to reacquaint myself. And the thing that stood out to me was that Native Americans were regarded as equals to him. That just says it to me, that, you know, I mean, we all do things to make money and to get along and to, but regarding those people as equals, as human beings in an equal, that's to me the primary concept of what makes him so special.
Yeah, and you know, any writer of any skill can say such a thing in their text. But what bears it out in Morton's case is not only his life experience, but the text itself, in that it repeats this from so many different angles, how much he admires them, respects them, needs them to be a success. And that's why he's recommending that the colonies develop a humane attitude so that they can, well, here we are again, so that they can all do well. And that was anathema. They no, we're not all going to do well. We're going to do well, and you people can go hang for all we care. And that was not satisfactory to Morton. So it's proven out in a lot of different directions and little emotional moments and observations where he lovingly describes how they track a deer, or how they catch their fish, or how they hold their seasonal revels and forget all their enmities in order to come together at a really plentiful food source and play games and feast and do their politics. He
I love the
sees
way
all
you
that.
bring that out in the book. You point to all the ways that he learns and the details of what he observes, which
Yeah.
we could use today.
Yeah. And it's even really simple. That there was one detail he mentioned that is almost as soon as I came ashore, he says, I was cloyed with lobster. Imagine people complaining having to eat lobster every night. So he learned how to bait his hook with lobster meat and catch bass. And that's the best eating there is when it's right out of the stream. So every just little things, he shows that he likes to learn the better way all the time. And if that's not what America is supposed to be about, I'll eat my hat or something. Yonca?
Again, well, thinking about the magisterial authority until the time when early New Englanders decided to compose their body of liberty until to the process when they pass through their common law. I think Morton presents a unique attitude, in terms of establishing the legal culture of the colony. I think this aspect of him really inspired me. Maybe I should include his attitude by rejecting, to obey the magisterial authority of the Puritans. This must be also one of my examples as I study legal culture. I think he is one of those earliest pioneers for establishing a legal culture. And when it was too early, they, even in the process of composing the body of liberties, there was Cotton laws, John Cotton's laws, which were so harsh on people. I think Morton has a distinguished place by standing against their magisterial authority. This is really interesting to me. I wonder what you would like to say about this.
One thing is that as I'm listening to you, I hear again many of the facts of his boyhood and his youth and his serious education, both in the classics and at the Inns of Court, which instilled in him, I believe, a real sense of flexibility. In other words, sure, you have to have laws. There has to be some organizing principle to have any kind of a community with a shape at all. But his anchor is the English common law, which is based on precedent and many points of view from judges, witnesses, lawyers, and all that. And he is not willing to be run over and bamboozled and hurried into some kind of a rigid new straitjacket of rules for behavior. He knows that life is bigger than that. And that's why I think ultimately, there's a lot of rancor in his book against the Puritans and the Pilgrims for their misguidedness and especially for their results, right? But most of all, he's laughing at them, and he wants readers to laugh at them, to say, please don't make these same foolish mistakes when you come over, because you won't do well. So flexibility and dedication to a code of law that has been time tested is really a big part of his voice.
Well, I appreciated his charisma. I mean, this is not so easy. Stand against majority. He's really a charisma to me. Yeah,
he does. He's not easily knocked off his feet. Nina?
And I think this is because he is also highly educated in legal studies. He has high education in laws. He knows the laws, therefore act. I think that's the point. Better we know about the laws, better we progress in our causes for striking back the injustices.
This is really important because because there's the old cliche. I think there's the Puritans who know the letter of the law, but Morton knows the spirit of the law.
That gives him self-confidence.
What I wanted to say earlier was that a lot of that, as you were talking, I flashed back to his early life and the culture that he comes from and the experiences he had in a community that was more collective, I would say, or more socially oriented. And also that you said he was in the west of Devon, and there were older cultures there. So in a sense, I identify with being marginalized in the sense that I come from many cultures, and that enables me, I'm not saying I'm Morton, but to see things, in a broader sense. All human beings are good. Yes, we have to get along. Yes, we need laws to protect ourselves from each other, blah, blah, blah. I could go on, but I think that a lot of that comes from his early experiences.
In a way, it seems like Morton was able to project himself into the future and to understand what all of these different people this diversity and, you know, and the impact on the environment, what this was all going to bring about. And it seems to me he was trying to kind of create a blueprint that people could use when, you know, going forward. And
Knew that
unfortunately, somebody threw it into the fire, but
people would be enriched by having more choices and things to look at, more ideas to look at.
Yeah,
That's what I was trying to point out about coming from many cultures.
Yeah.
Hey, he did.
Yeah.
He knew that your life is fuller, better when you have lots of options and ways of thinking.
Yeah,
You're right.
and he understood also, I think, right from his early days when maybe his parents or somebody would take him to Bristol or to one of the local big towns where they would have a public revels, and he sort of intuitively understood that you need at least two things to give a community shape and endurance. One is ritual, ceremony, public remembering, ritual and memory. And that's exactly what's in the last two lines of his now infamous or famous poem, Nailed Up to the Maypole, that here the 1st of May shall here at Merrymount be kept holiday. We're going to get together. We're going to remember how we first came together. We'll see how well we're doing, check in, confer. I mean, that's part of what feasting does too. It allows people to sit down after dinner and talk politics. You know, so the ritualization of community and the remembrance of how it was created and what it's supposed to mean and do. I think he understood these things intuitively. And if you can call that visionary, I'll sign on to that. Sure.
He's a little bit reminiscent, just a little bit, not wholly, because is Samuel Champlain, because he also, with a very, you know, he wanted to experience the life that, you know, the wilderness was able to provide, but he also really encouraged, you know, his people to, you know, to engage with the native people and to, you know, to encourage them to marry and to be merry and you know, and to dance together. And that's one of the things that you know, is pretty interesting comparison, is that they often would dance together, Native Americans dancing their dances and the French dancing their dances, but it's always this dance around the fire and how that brings about a sense of collectiveness. And you know, I think it's a wonderful image that Morton leaves for us here in modernity, because we don't do that, at least not in this country. You know, they do it in Russia, they do it in Turkey, they do it, you know, all around the world, but you know, you'll never see a bunch of Americans, you know, gathering together in a circle dance like that, unless you're Native American. No, yeah, I'm sorry, Nina. So at any rate, I just thought that was interesting.
And Black American families get together and dance too.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Yeah, like, and you know, when I was researching the film that I produced about Morton's life, I went to a lot of different communities around New England that advertised that they were having a Maypole Revels. So here and there, quietly, these things do happen, and people are very passionate about them. Those who are involved with them, it does happen here and there. But for me, the problem is, you know, with Morton, the secret of the civic life was right in plain sight. It was for everyone to participate in. But nowadays it's shunted aside into commercialism and into propagandistic holidays. It's hard to think, well, you have Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the 4th of July. And I'm 68 years old and I haven't seen a lot of progressive bonding coming about through those rites, you know? I think he understood some very effective mechanisms for bringing people together.
Did he also understand, you think, the negative aspects, how the Puritan religion kind of, I don't want to say dumbed down, but kind of encouraged a lack of faithfulness to, you know, scholarly and academic studies. I mean, he makes fun of the pastor, I'm trying to remember his name, for being uneducated. I mean, this seemed to be a constant theme, you know, this criticism of inability to face reality. So,
and we might not have time to get to it tonight, but there's a fellow that he nicknames Master Bubble, who originally came over and wanted to be a minister or a stenographer of the native language, but he didn't want to be bothered learning the language. So he skipped to being a pastor and whatnot. And he said all he could do is put people to sleep. And what he brings out and exposes is that the Plymouth people and the Puritans had a terrible time finding the right pastors, because all they had were not learning, not humanism, not the classics. All they had were two things they called zeal and gifts. If you could make a big Jimmy Swaggart type of hoo-ha out of your lecture and throw in a few biblical passages, then you'd move what one called the common people, the rude people who are suckered in by these pyrotechnics. But if that's all you have, what are you going to be talking about? And he gets tired of it very quickly. He says, I've gone to their services, but they're all the same. They're all the same. I was a sinner. Now I've seen the light, and now I am healed, and I'm part of the obedient part of the community. And yeah, great, but they're all the same. That's the only story they want to tell. So he wants culture and creation, not just conformity.
Well, that is very much like what's happening today.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that people who are not even religious are acting or behaving or thinking or not thinking like religious fundamentalists, not going outside, not questioning. Since the 70s in this country, we have gone backwards, really fast in terms of, you can even discuss it in terms of newspapers, how many newspapers there were and how many different owners. The consolidation of media is another aspect of the dumbing down of the people in the United States, which reminds me of what you're talking about, what was happening with the Puritans and their culture and what's happening now is very similar in a way.
And say all you want about the Bible, it's got some nice aspects, but God help us if that's the only book we can have.
Yeah, I especially lose it where people shall have dominion over the earth or the animals. It's like, that's, to me, that is like sin. If you want to use the word sin.
Yeah, I think
we're here to take care of the earth and each other.
I think you can see a lot of this reflected in the theological education that goes on in this country right now. We used to have a lot of theological education associated with some of the great universities of the country, Yale and Harvard and Colgate and Princeton, and all of that is kind of falling by the wayside. Many of them are down to 50, 60, 70 students. There were like 500, 600 a few years ago, but but around the country proliferated all these little Bible schools, and so you can go to Bible school without a college education or anything, and learn a few verses and some doctrines, and learn to be a dramatist, because I think that's part of what what's going on, and you're a minister, you get your ordination, and basically this is the mainstream religion of the United States now, with the decline in numbers of what we used to call the mainstream.
Well, I think real education makes people unpredictable. You don't know what their response is going to be. You don't know what kind of thoughts they're going to have. And this is being slowly bred out of us in favor of commodification. My father, I was very close with, he was a decorated World War II veteran. And I asked him one time, I said, what are you thinking when you step in front of a machine gun for the side of your the victory? Maybe you're going to die today, but your side is going to win. What are you thinking? And he said, just don't let it be a waste. Don't let it be a waste. There's only a few differences between America and the Nazi German order, and they had quasi-computers, rockets, all synthetic oil, all kinds of technological wonders, right? But you know what they didn't have? Freedom of expression. That's the central difference. So if you don't actively practice and create with your freedom, what are you doing with it?
You will end up becoming a monster.
Yeah, or at least boring as hell, right? Because you're always, all your learning pours you back into the church, and all things are known in the church. We know why we're here. We know where we're going, and that's not evolution. That's not a journey or an adventure. It's it's a machine, and I don't think Morton wanted much any part of it.
That
Well,
reminds me of what you first said about that. It's basically about conquest. So I forget what you said exactly, but earlier on, maybe the first time, you were talking about the Bible and patriarchy as just conquest, and I forget what other word you used, but that the control of people to seize other people's lands and goods.
Yeah. It's a disciplinary mechanism that allows you to control your own population for your own ends. They understand this high in the mysteries, but you're the one pulling the strings above, the imperial strings, and telling them where to go, who to kill, what to bring back. It's not much of a civilization.
The more you talk, the more amazed I am at how important this man is and how little, just like most history that we learn in school, we have to unlearn. And this should be taught, included in curriculum.
That's why I said from the first, imagine if his quote about nature was on the front page of every history and literature book. You'd have some pretty high standards. That's a hard act to follow. But we don't get that. We get the pilgrims, and they saw themselves as God's children. And, okay, fine, you saw yourself that way. But what else you got to tell me? Teach me something else interesting, It doesn't take you very far at all. Yonca, I think, was trying to get in. So
it's okay. I was thinking about your comments on the evolution of American thought in 19th century and what influence could be pursue from Morton's contributions to this phase. Regarding his attitude towards religion, can we say Morton's could be seen as a kind of forerunner to 18th century deism, enlightened, enlightened first were following the, this new way of thinking about religion, deism, believing in God without the church, without the central authority. Can we say Morton kind of forerunner to that kind of thinking in the
I think you can.
century?
I do think you can, because of the sort of distance we already talked about from different directions between his belonging firmly to the Anglican Church. I'm sure he was, a respected member of some church somewhere in his old boyhood. But then there's this uncontrollable flexibility about him that isn't, building a church is not anywhere near his first thought when he comes to America. There are more important things that need to be taken care of. And
That
there are
is really
more
something.
that he sees from the Indians, I think, and as well from the other European people who were around, that there's more than one way to understand what we call God. And once you take that relative position, everybody has a piece of the truth. Now you're beginning to talk or think in democratic terms, that everybody brings something to the table, and God is not particularly interested in approving one over the other or excluding all the others in favor of one. I think that's a very sort of pre-revolutionary America kind of way of thinking. And once you reject the overall dogmatism or ideology that runs in the colonial and imperialist project, you begin to look for ancestors. You begin to look for, isn't there anybody else who thinks the way I do? And between the lines of a lot of 18th and 19th century writing about America by people who lived there or people who visited, they had Morton in mind. I know this from 40 years of snooping through the halls of academe and American literature, that when he spontaneously emotes about his love for the hummingbird, or his being entertained by Mr. Beaver, or all kinds of ways that he notices beautiful things about nature and records them so lovingly, that is infectious. And by the time the first naturalists, professional naturalists, maybe the Bartram brothers and Audubon, who was a notorious racist, but he did a lot to revolutionize American thinking about nature. they've almost all got Morton in their back pocket because there's almost no one else for them to call on in that role. And I think also, as you can tell from the sampler of about 100 opinions from many leading historians of the ages since Morton was alive, right? Well, why are they writing such vitriol against him? Because they've read him and they find him very troubling and disturbing to the ideology that they wish everyone else would subscribe to, including the contempt for nature and reducing it to a commodity, not to mention sweeping away of the 13,000-year-old civilization that was there before them without a virtual thought. Morton's book will not allow you to do that. And that's a dangerous proposition. So I think he was the bad boy of American literature, but he was, what's the kind of thing, when the Catholic Church would outlaw texts under the Codex of forbidden books you mustn't look at, that's what drives everybody to read them.
Right, right.
If you can get them.
I was
Excuse me.
shocked to learn, taking it. If you didn't go to church, you were fined, from what you were describing in his early days in Britain, and that his town agreed, or his group, or what culture agreed, that, look, if you were going to fight with somebody, don't go to church. I did not know that people were fined if they did not attend church. That, to me, is profound to understand everything that follows, just in coming from that kind of a setup. You know, I don't really know that history at all, really. So
Well, it's sure a practice that tells you that they themselves, the authorities, they don't have much confidence in their content. They don't have much confidence that people are going to spontaneously show up and hooray for the Lord every Sunday, no matter what it costs them or what they happen to personally believe. If you have to enforce attendance at a ritual, you're not doing very well.
Mm.
Morton says they made a great show of humanity. Excuse me, they make a great show of religion, but no humanity. That's the way he would have put it.
Also, you mentioned Audubon as being racist.
Yeah.
Wasn't he ethnically, mixed? I'm not saying mixed race, because we're all the same race. Some of us have Neanderthal or Denisovian,
Culturally,
but we're all the same race. So I thought he came from a culturally diverse background from the Caribbean. I'm surprised that he was a racist, but, living there.
Well, without going into too much detail of it, his personal writings reflect some pretty ugly opinions about the native people that he too, in his way, was pushing aside in order to get at the birds that he killed in order to study them. So some attitudes going on there.
Well, okay.
I was going to say, I think this is a good point to finish our conversation. I think I'm going to finish it about a couple of comments earlier.
You don't mean end, do you?
But I don't know. I was kind of sensing that we were flagging a bit. We can continue.
Well, there's a lot of good stuff to come if you want to hang in there just a little bit.
Let's keep going. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, and I'll take a pause very soon. Believe me, I just want to provide people with the basic facts of Morton's biography so they can see the trajectory or the arc of his experience. We talked about his boyhood. We talked about his education, about his going to the Inns of Court, developing a great respect for the common law, about his landing in America on a small investment, on his meeting the 13,000-year-old Native American peoples and what they were all about and how he learned about them and they about him. We talked about his gun trade, which was neither illegal nor really disapproved by the ruling authorities, and that's why Morton was never prosecuted. And that this, in contradistinction to Plymouth and his defunct neighbor Weymouth, led him to a tremendous prosperity because of the assistance of native people in obtaining the fur trade. So 1627, they raised the maypole. All comers are invited, even the pilgrims, although they don't really enjoy themselves. Let's leave it at that for now, because they wanted to have wives. They wanted to marry into the native culture and become mutually prosperous. This is the beginning of the Keystone Cops period, because by that next summer, Captain Shrimp, whom Morton nicknamed Captain Miles Standish because he was diminutive in height, ambushed Morton at Weymouth, where he was visiting the ruins with a few kind of old comers and hangers on there. They confined him inside a blockhouse, and they sat inside there with him, drinking to celebrate their capture of the great monster, as he said. But Morton was feigning his share of the drinking that night, and when they all passed out or fell asleep, he crept up to the door, opened the inside door, latched it again, walked to the outside door, opened that, stepped outside, and then slammed the door and ran off toward Merrymount. So he was mocking the hell out of them, saying, "You can't hold me, you fool." So imagine him running 10 or so miles from Weymouth to Merrymount and getting his crew together, and they're after us, they're after us. And who, the Indians? No, the English, the Plymouth people. So they show up with Standish and his 9 worthies, as Morton calls them. There's an almost gunfight, and Morton surrenders to them, despite the dangers, rather than see any violence done. They maroon him on what's called the Isles of Shoals. This is a little string of boulder-like islands sticking out in the North Atlantic off of Dover, New Hampshire. He's picked up by a fishing boat that fall. So he survived the whole summer there somehow without probably fresh water, unless deriving it from fish and clams and so forth. He goes back to England. He is not rebuked, not even rebuked, Bradford complains, and shows up back in 1629. Dennis, this is the time when Morton had that meeting with the would-be bosses of New England trade, where they said, "We'll construe the rules of the game according to the word of God," and all that. And Morton said, "No, no, 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 we're not going to have an economy or a state construed in the word of God by you people. I'm sorry, I'm not going to sign up for that." So it really anticipated Roger Morton's objections to an elite coterie of would-be leaders who wanted to control everybody by themselves construing what the Bible was telling them to do. Meanwhile, Salem is starving to death. Their trading is so poor. They come to Merrymount, they chop down the maypole, and that's the origin event of Hawthorne's 1837 story, The Maypole of Merrymount. And they themselves, the Salem Company, were an advance group for Boston. June 1630, the great flotilla of 7 ships arrives off Massachusetts Bay to found Boston with John Winthrop and Anne Bradstreet and all that gang. Morton's on the hill watching them arrive and says, "I can show you where to find fresh water. I can bring you up some meat. I can hunt pretty well. You better, if you're going to build with bricks, you better put some lime in those bricks so they won't melt in the rain." And they wouldn't listen to him for anything. Well, they set up their colony as of June. By September, they had a court, and Morton was, as I mentioned, the first order of business. "You are out of here. Not a trial, not a discovery, not an investigation, just we have you on various charges that added up to nothing." They couldn't get a warrant or anything about him, and hoisted him in a cow's harness onto a ship to send him home back to England. And he's shaking his fist saying, "I'm not going to come after you with my well-armed Indian friends. I'm going back to England, and I'm going to get legal revenge against you and your so-called charter. I'm going to fix you for this," because they burned down his house. They love to do cruel acts that would show who's the boss. They burned his whole plantation down in sight of the Indians, as he called them, who wept to see this, and they were faced suddenly with the coldest winter then on record that following year. They needed houses to keep warm in. So Morton just makes it back to England. They've starved him on this ship in a winter voyage. He files a lawsuit via the Council for New England, and the writing that he does about what happened and the offenses against him become what you call a legal brief, which eventually evolves into New English Canaan. 20 chapters on the people there, 10 chapters on the natural commodities, and 30 chapters on the abuses of English common law that the Puritans have committed. Now, Morton wins his lawsuit, but by the time that he's going to come back in his late 70s to end his days in, quote, "the land which he loveth," the English government is almost at civil war. King Charles has no ability to enforce the judgment against Boston and its charter. And even so, Boston was so shaken up by this, the news of this victory, that they built a fort on Castle Island to, I guess, shoot at the king's troops if they came to try to take the charter. Well, guess what? In June, you get a lot of rain in New England, and the fort melted. We're talking a movie here that would, in most action movies, you've got a fortress of some kind blowing up with big fireballs. Well, their fort melted in the rain because they hadn't listened to Morton about how to build.
Right.
Now, the dark part of this is that 10 years to the month, May 1637, after Morton's rebels, 10 years later, New England launched the Pequot War. This was an outright extermination mission to take over the Connecticut Valley and southern New England by exterminating and sweeping away the Pequot Nation. I'm going to get to that in a second because it was a complete fiasco that proved out everything Morton had warned them about. But as I mentioned, 1640s, King Charles's government is failing. He can't enforce Morton's victory. 1645, the churches are complaining in New England that the people are drifting away for greener pastures. They're seeing the world out there too. And they don't want to spend all their time in church. So their attendance is falling off. And that's eventually why they founded America's public school system, to try to give people some kind of a new cohesive code by which to live. But it was maybe too little too late. So Morton, in that same year, 1645, returns, and under his arm, he's got a patent in a roll-up tube for certain lands in Maine, near what was Agamenticus, now called York, Maine. And this was supposed to be a safety valve colony for all the dissidents, because it wasn't just Morton who was being persecuted by them. Excuse me. There were a lot of people who wanted to get the hell out of Puritan New England. And so Morton brought them a patent, a right to live and settle on this land in Maine from an aristocrat. Boston has arrested Morton, kept him over the winter in an unheated cell in chains to the decaying, he says, of his limbs. He files an appeal the next year. And when they have a finding at the court, they find, well, we've been waiting for evidence against you, but nothing has arrived. So we want you to get the hell out of here, leave your rings and your coat and anything else of value you have to pay your fines, and get out of here. So Morton trundled off up to Maine, and there are very problematic historical records that claim, on the one hand, that he lived about 2 years longer, and others that he died soon after. We're just not sure, because I could show you the fingerprints on the meddling of the old manuscripts where editors wanted to continue to make Morton a moral hazard, right? But there was an old planter named Samuel Maverick who also wrote a little description of New England in 1660. And he mentioned Morton saying, New English Canaan was the truest description of New England as then it was that ever I saw. So there's one testimony anyway, despite all the acrimony against him. So from there, as we know, Thomas Morton's whole life and experience and writings have been flipped into a reckless libertine. And if you want, I'll stop right after. I'd like to share one little statement from an editor of 1855's The History of Massachusetts about Thomas Morton. Here's an example, a very good mainstream example of what they did to him. The work of Morton is a singular performance. That part of it relating to the customs of the Indians and the natural history of the country is interesting and valuable. But the rest abounds in low wit, and that species of lampoonery better befitting a denizen of Billingsgate than a champion of the honor and dignity of the Episcopal Church. Morton's seasoning may be relished by some for its coarseness, but it lacks the true Attic flavor, and is but a miserable attempt to imitate the most execrable and disgusting of the classic authors with whose scurrility, buffoonery, and mendacity he fully sympathized. Were the whole work like a few of its chapters, it would add much to its character and to the fame of its author, as a more favorable estimate of his moral qualities would be warranted, were not the lack of these qualities so striking and palpable, even by his own showing. That makes you want to go read the guy, doesn't it?
So, yeah,
Yes,
I thank you.
absolutely.
Incredible, enormous, thorough research. I mean, it's amazing what you have just imparted just in this, just today even. I thank you.
Well, those who go through those who go through graduate school understand me when I say that if you see a person laughing a lot, they've probably been driven crazy by the graduate school program. But for me, Morton was making me laugh every day. It was a delight to do it.
Right. Can you?
I'm going to stop it. I'm going to stop right there. Okay.
Okay, Dennis, you're asking me about Thomas Morton's legacies and influences, what he may mean to us today. I'd like to first up offer people a number of resources on that. One is that I produced 2 films at YouTube. One is called Thomas Morton and the Maypole of Merrymount, and one is called Nani, a native New England story, and you'll see his presence in both of those works. My main professional site is ancientlights.org, and you can go there and read for free the whole central book, book 2, about Morton's 10 chapters about nature in native New England. There's a kid's book there for which I'm looking for an illustrator, and there's a full-length movie script there that I've been trying for years to try to make happen, because Morton's story to me says movie more than almost anything I've seen since Little Big Man, put it that way. And lastly, my blog is Jack Dempsey Writer at WordPress.com. Jack Dempsey Writer at WordPress.com, and there's a number of Morton-related research presentations there that I think you might enjoy. One way of construing Morton's significance is that, well, a best recent read by David Graeber and David Wengrow is called The Dawn of Civilization. It's this enormous new anthropological work, just came out last year. And it really complicates the idea that we've been on this march of progress through human history, moving from primitive and simple to complicated and tyrannous, right? But they're showing, and I mean fine-tooth detail, that there have been all kinds of other communities, Native American, English, French, European, African, where people play a lot more creatively with power than you might expect. They start a new order when they're sick of the old one. They walk out on the old one when they're tired of it. That explains, for example, why there are so many, you could say, ancient ruins around the world that appear to have been buried deliberately, or appear to have been abandoned deliberately, not just in haste of a conquest or something. So this is all go to say that where he mentions Morton's era, by the 1700s, there was still almost no discussion in Europe of individual freedom and democracy. This was all out on the edges, the fringes, the ranters and the Quakers and all this kind of stuff. But what affected Europe's thought with itself about these ideas, and then back to America, was that a lot of tracts were coming from America that interviewed Native American leaders who would always be asking these questions like, why do some people in your culture have nothing and other people have everything? Are you sure you want to live in a state of constant warfare? Why do you incentivize bad behavior and then punish people when they take advantage of it? Morton was asking exactly those kinds of questions all the way through when he compared the native culture and in its shadow, the English culture, with Plato's Commonwealth, as he called it. He said the native people, they, rather than not share one biscuit, they would starve all. They knew how to share things, and they didn't need very much. They didn't need all these accoutrements that the Europeans were trying to sell them. So Morton is both an expression and anticipation of the increasing discourses of freedom, liberty, and democracy. I mean, the maypole itself, in a proof of that, the maypole became the Liberty Pole in the 1770s. Wow. The maypole became the Liberty Pole. So while the Puritans, here's a sense of Morton's literary legacy that I think will make you laugh. While the Puritans pretended to what they called the plain style, don't give me metaphors, don't give me ancient classic references, just tell me the facts in very clear prose. Well, as I said, Morton found that culturally boring because he had been exposed to the classics and learned to enjoy them. This makes him the wellspring of American letters in real literary depth. And in the United States, in America. He was for the Renaissance, not the Reformation. He was looking at or hearing from people like Marsilio di Ficino and Petrarch and Boccaccio, Thomas More, Ronsard in France. Here's a quick example of how pointed. Every time in grad school I was looking up some obscure reference Morton would use, bang, it like an arrow right to the heart of the matter. He's talking about this guy, Master Bubble, who is again this idiot that comes to try to work with him and screws everything up. And he says this guy just picks up his big heavy burden. He's a big boned man, and he picks up his heavy burden, puts it on his shoulder like Milo. Okay, little casual reference, like Milo. Who was Milo? He was a Greek strongman, all right, a famous wrestler. But there's also another Milo who was a Roman senatorial presence who thought himself emperor. And this is exactly the curve of this guy Bubbles' personality. He basically knows nothing, but wants to take over everything. All right. And in the telling of that story, Morton leaves us what I find in Frontier Letters, the first multicultural point of view. Because as Bubble gets himself lost in the woods with his pants on over his head because he's afraid of arrows that aren't coming at him, and the Indians panic and they say, they're going to say, we killed him. We better go back and tell them what happened, but they're afraid to do that. And so with all this panic and mayhem on the English side, the Indians are standing there in the forest saying, what do you think we should do? On the one hand, this, on the one hand, that. So these are, well, explicitly rational beings. Another example of Morton's literary acumen in using the classics is in his poem that he nailed to the maypole in 1627. This is a little poem called an epyllion. It's a little epic love story that concerns the fate of whole peoples. There was a genre of it at the Inns of Court at the time. Morton's two characters in that story, he calls Scylla or Niobe, and the male is called Samson. Now, when you look up Scylla and Niobe and all the variations of the myths about them, you know what you find most centrally is that, as I mentioned when he mentioned King David in reference to the plague, Scylla was a very attractive, young, quasi-divine female, but she was attacked not for any shameful or flirtatious or teasing behavior, just because the men were bringing this evil energy toward her. It echoes what Morton said about the plague. It wasn't the Indians' fault, but look at her. She's sitting on the ground weeping for her children like Niobe. She had boasted to Zeus how beautiful her children were, and he punished her by turning her into a rock by the sea. And do you know that if you walk a mile up the coast from Morton's Maypole site to Massachusetts Hummock, you go out on the beach there, and there is exactly such a rock formation called Squaw Rock that during rainy seasons appears to weep running down its face. It's quite amazing. So there's another way. Now, the funny part about Samson, making the English hero like Samson, is that you think, well, he slaughtered the Philistines and he was a great champion of their war against the Canaanites and all this kind of stuff, very dedicated to God. But actually, his strength was his weakness. In other words, he fell in love with Delilah, a Philistine woman, and his own parents say to him in the Bible, why do you go with this unclean foreign woman? She's not one of us. And he says, she pleaseth me. So I like her. He's not interested. So he's telling the Englishmen around him, give into it. You like these people. It's okay. You know, so he gives them heroes that allow them to be anti-heroes. It's quite clever. One other reversal that's really worth mentioning, because we already talked about Plato's Commonwealth and his idea of sharing, is that Ben Jonson, one of his quasi-contemporaries at the Inns of Court, wrote this on the famous voyage. And it's a kind of a glittering beginning of the wonders of modernity and capitalism and all this stuff. And it ends in a mire of marketplace mud, where everybody is just as corrupt and criminal and violent and ugly as you can imagine. Morton, in his Bacchanal Triumph, this long rhyming poem that he wrote in probably 1629, turns all those figures, as usual, on their heads. So that he says, when I was dragged to Plymouth, it was as if they dragged me to an enchanted castle. And I was put on trial there by these three judges, Minos, Iacchus, and Rhadamanthus. This is the three Minoan ancient Greek judges of hell. These correspond exactly to William Bradford, William Brewster, their elder, Captain Miles Standish, and other personalities actually there at Plymouth. And as they, you could say, pretend to be worthy to judge him, everything is stood on its head, because while his rebels represented order, a way of bringing people's energies together, theirs is a way of dividing them and killing all the joy around them. So he finds very rich literary reversal ways to make his points about New England while employing the most distant, far-off references you could imagine. Now, in the quest, and I'll finally stop here, but in the quest for a true American literature, as we often see in Walt Whitman, and that's 1850, all these writers before him were saying, we need to get rid of all this European influence, and we don't want classical myths in our literature anymore. Just give us the straight stuff. Well, I think that was an impoverishment rather than something else that they wanted it to be. In other words, you know, when this is a country that says the past is prologue, everything up to us has been just prologue to what we're going to do. And I think Morton would have laughed at that attitude. So comments, questions, just things, that's some of his literary influence that has touched a lot of writers down the years.
I'm astounded by how much he knew.
Yes, me too.
Astounded.
It's so impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so impressive. I mean, thinking about the degree of literacy, even the amount of people who were literate in the early colonial days, his education and also his wisdom. I mean, education is not enough to gather all these sources together. You need to have that wisdom to bring them together. I think he was such a unique person, really.
Yeah, and for all his experience and learning, the thing that binds it all together is his, you could say, sense of humor. Because even when they burn his house down in front of his eyes, he says, well, these are the things that happen to you in life. It's ludicrous and unfair, but I'll just have to get over it and carry on. And so he does. Dennis, you look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, you know, in the context of today, it seems to me that you know, we're very much facing a similar situation where there's a real sense of existential threat in what's going on between you know, Christians, right-wing Christians, and the rest of us, which, you know, we're the majority, but it seems that we're about to be taken over by a minority at this point, and that process has already begun. And you know, I think about the similarities between Morton's day and our own day. Our ability to make fun of you know, the right-wing Christians who seem to dominate on the web and, you know, in the mega churches in this country, and our ability to make fun of them and to kind of cast them aside in our minds as if they aren't really dangerous to the fabric of the country, when, you know, in fact they are. And you know, we're facing a lot of the same kinds of corruption and destruction, you know, in our communities that they were in the early 1600s. So,
and that goes on because it's never been questioned. But this is, to me, one of the capital ways that Morton's text is important as a historical source, because it's contradicting that. He's asking, as I mentioned before, that do you want to live in a martialist war state? Is this how you want to set up the America of the future? 10 years, only 10 years after Morton's May rebels, 1637, May 1st, Connecticut's birthday. That coincides with their declaration of exterminatory war against the Pequots, even as they're leveling laws and new conformity regulations against their own population, because, as I mentioned, of the failing of the churches. So what kind of new history comes out of this when they found the public schools? Well, I'll tell you, in 1637, the English imagined that they could march overland into Connecticut unnoticed, surprise, surround, and massacre the Pequots at a place called Missituck or Mystic, and thereby break the back of Pequot dominion and take over the whole Connecticut Valley. But here's what the Puritans of Boston, for example, say themselves about the quandaries that they're in launching this thing. They say, we don't know the landscape. We don't know the interrelations among all these native peoples. We can't distinguish them tribe by tribe unless it's by their attitude toward us. We can't chase them through the woods in our heavy armor with our swords and halberds and all this. We can't catch them. We don't know what is their style of warfare. We're going to lay a siege by surrounding the Missituck village and massacre everybody, starve them out. Well, the Indians aren't even in there. There's a small contingent force there to draw them in, and then they reverse the whole field of battle on the English, and now they're in the trap. The best thing they can do is head down Mystic Ford Hill to the water, where they happen to meet reinforcements coming in by boat, who have only been attracted to that spot because of the smoke from the Indian village that they burnt. But as you might remember from, I think, part one, where I was quoting a Native American named Peter Thomas, that Native American communities cooperate when there's a crisis. This is exactly how they outwitted the English, because as the English tried to capture them, catch them, or kill them, they didn't know what tribe they were dealing with. From one individual to the next, they would melt back and forth into other groups who were not threatened the way the Pequots were, at least at that time. So you don't know the land, you don't know the people, you don't know how they fight war. Does any of this sound familiar?
Yes.
These and the captains who wrote these accounts posed them as a great victory, but no one ever left the colonies to check up on the facts of this great victory. So what we have is a fiasco dressed up as a great frontier victory. And that's what they started teaching in the schools. See what I mean? It hardwired people for how to behave when you go out there into that next tranche of woodland, encounter native people. In other words, be violent, because that's what works against them. You've got to be murderously violent, because otherwise you just will never be able to control them. And that's what we've been doing from New England to Vietnam to a lot of other places. We live now in a war state, and Morton allows us to begin to reject that, because it's not normal.